She's beautiful, isn't she? Not like the plain little thing I was forced to bind myself to." The words came through the half-open door of the eastern solar, and they landed in Melis's chest like a blade turned slowly. She had come to bring her mate his evening wine, the goblet warm in her 2 hands, and now the goblet trembled, and the wine slid up the silver rim and stained the pale cuff of her sleeve like blood. She did not scream. Somewhere behind her ribs the mate bond, the invisible cord that had bound her to Calen Thorne, the Alpha King of the Ashfell Dominion, since the night of their joining, went taut and then went cold, the way a lake goes cold the instant the sun drops behind the mountains. She pressed her spine to the corridor wall and listened, because a woman who has just felt her own heart called plain and forced has already lost the right to walk away in ignorance. "The elders will grumble," another voice answered, a woman's voice, honeyed and idle. "But they always grumble. Give it a season, love, and no one will remember her name." And Calen, her Calen, laughed. He laughed the low, warm laugh she had believed was hers alone, the one he used to press into the crown of her hair in the dark, and he said, "No one remembers a shadow once the lamp is lit." Melis looked down at the wine bleeding into her cuff, and understood, with a clarity so sudden it felt like cold water poured over her scalp, that she had been the shadow all along, and that the lamp had a name, and the name was not hers. She set the goblet down on the sill without a sound. She did not weep. She would learn later that grief, real grief, is quiet, that it does not announce itself, that it simply moves into the house of the body and begins, room by room, to turn off the lights. And in that dark quiet, she made the only vow that mattered. Not vengeance. Not yet. Something colder and more useful. I will not spend 1 more hour begging to be seen by a man who has already decided I am furniture. When I am gone, she thought, you will finally learn what a shadow was holding up. She walked back to her own chambers with the measured, unhurried gait of a woman who has decided something enormous and intends to give away nothing. The corridors of Ironhold Keep were carved from black basalt, veined with silver, and the torches guttered in their iron sconces, and the great wolves of the royal guard bowed their heads as she passed because she was still, for a few hours more, their queen. She let them bow. She memorized the way the firelight moved on the walls, the smell of pine resin and cold stone, the distant clangor of the forge where the smiths worked through the night, because she knew she would never see any of it again, and she wanted to remember precisely what she was leaving, so that no false nostalgia could ever lure her back. In her chambers she lit no lamp. She moved by moonlight, and moonlight for her kind was as good as day. She went to the great carved wardrobe that Calen had commissioned for her on the first anniversary of their binding, a wardrobe as tall as 2 men and inlaid with mother-of-pearl moons, and she opened it to take out the one plain travelling cloak she still owned from her life before the crown. That was when she saw them, hanging among her own gowns, pushed carelessly to one side, as though they had every right to be there, were 3 dresses that were not hers. Silk the colour of arterial red, a gown of midnight blue sewn with tiny seed pearls, a morning robe of cream and gold, still carrying the scent of a perfume she did not wear, jasmine and crushed amber. The scent she had smelled, she realized now, on Calen's collar for weeks, and told herself was incense from the council hall. So it was not new. That was the detail that finished her, the small domestic obscenity of another woman's clothing hung in her own closet, in her own home, arranged with the confidence of a woman who had been told the space would soon be hers. It meant this had been decided long ago. It meant that while Maelys had risen before dawn to review the granary ledgers, he could not be bothered to read, while she had sat up through the fever nights of the border pups and brought their frightened mother's broth with her own hands, while she had negotiated the fragile grain truce with the river clans that kept his people fed through the black winters. He had been measuring another woman for her crown. She reached out and touched the red silk, and it was cool and expensive and utterly foreign, and she felt the last warm thing inside her go finally, cleanly dark. She did not tear the dresses down. She did not slash them, though her claws ached at her fingertips to do it. Instead she smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile, and she thought, "You have shown me exactly how little time I have. Thank you." She took her plain grey cloak from its hook. She left the red and the blue and the cream where they hung, because they were not hers to touch, and because leaving them was its own kind of message, and because a woman who takes nothing can never be accused of taking anything. Then she sat down at her writing desk in the dark and began, methodically, to dismantle her own disappearance from the inside out, and if her hand shook once, only once, when she signed her name, no one living ever saw it. They believed she had nothing of her own, and that belief was the first stone in the wall they had built without ever knowing they were building it. For 3 years, Maelys had played the part of the grateful bride, the low-born healer's daughter elevated beyond her station, the woman who owed everything to the Alpha King's generous whim. She had let them believe she was helpless, because helplessness made her invisible, and invisibility, she had learned young, is the closest thing to armor a powerless person can own. But Maelys had never been helpless. She had been careful. There is a difference, and Calen Thorne would spend the rest of his life learning it. 3 years ago, in the 2nd month of her marriage, she had overheard 2 of the elder wives laughing about the last queen, the one before her, the one who had displeased the crown and been quietly set aside with nothing but the clothes on her back and a one-way carriage to a border village where she had died within the year. Maelys had gone back to her rooms that night and understood, with the cold practicality that had kept her family fed through 3 famine winters, that a queen without her own resources was not a queen at all, but a decoration that could be thrown away. So she had begun, patiently, to build a floor beneath herself that no one could see. She had done it through the ledgers. Calen despised the accounts, thought them beneath an alpha, believed that gold appeared because the Dominion was strong and vanished because clerks were thieves, and he had handed the whole tangled apparatus of the royal treasury to his clever, unthreatening little wife, the way a man hands his coat to a servant. She had taken it gratefully, and over 3 years, moving with the slowness of a glacier and the invisibility of dust, she had learned every artery and vein through which the kingdom's wealth flowed. She learned which of the outer holdings paid their tithes late and which never paid at all. She learned that the great iron mines of the Northern Reach, the true engine of Ashfell's power, were leased under a charter so old and so carelessly worded that the actual ownership of the ore rights had never once been formally transferred to the crown after the last conquest. She learned that a healer named Wren of the River Clans, her own mother's cousin, held a decades-old unpaid debt against the royal house for medicines supplied during the plague years, a debt that had quietly compounded into a sum that could purchase a small province. And she learned, most usefully of all, to move money the way water moves through limestone, invisibly, patiently, downward, until it pools where you want it. She had never stolen a single coin. She was far too intelligent for theft. What she had done instead was arrange the kingdom's own legitimate obligations so that the crown's debts flowed, through a lattice of shell holdings and clan intermediaries, and honestly recorded transactions toward accounts that answered ultimately, quietly, only to her. That night she wrote 3 letters. The first was to Wren, and it was very short, and it contained a single instruction and a phrase in the old river tongue that meant the roof is falling. Come to the appointed door. The second was to a woman named Ottilien, the keep's ancient laundress, who had washed the royal linens for 40 years, and seen 4 queens come and go, and had been, in her wordless way, the only creature in Ironhold who had ever treated Maelys with plain human kindness, bringing her warmed stones for her feet in the winter, and never once bowing more deeply than affection required. The 3rd letter she did not send. The 3rd letter she left on her pillow, beside her crown, beside the great mate bond ring of white gold and blackened iron that had never fit her finger properly, and it said only, I release you from a duty you had already abandoned. Keep the crown. It was always heavier for me than for you. She would let him find it in the morning and read into it whatever wounded thing he needed to read. Then she took off the ring. It was harder than she expected. The metal seemed to cling to her skin, and when it finally came free, the phantom cord of the bond snapped fully, and she gasped and gripped the edge of the desk. Because the severing of a mate bond is not a metaphor. It is a real wound in a real place inside the chest that has no name in any human tongue, and for one long moment she could not breathe, could not see, could only feel the enormous cold rushing in to fill the space where he had been. Then it passed. It passed the way a wave passes, leaving the shore harder and cleaner than before, and she stood up straight and wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely herself, and entirely alone, and entirely free. Ottilien came for her an hour before dawn. The old woman said nothing, only pressed a bundle into her hands, bread and hard cheese, and a stoppered flask of mountain spirits, and a purse of honest copper coin, the sort that could not be traced, the sort that a laundress saves across 40 years. I heard them in the drying yard, Ottilien murmured, her voice like dry leaves. The perfumed one and her women, measuring the throne room for new banners, in your colours that are not yours any more. Maelys nodded. She had suspected the ambition ran that deep. You knew, she said, and it was not an accusation. I have washed the sheets of this house since before that boy king could walk, Ottilien said, and I know a rot when I smell it in the linen. Go, child, go before the sun. Once the sun is up, they'll expect you at the morning court, and a queen who is missed is a queen who is hunted. She took Maelys's face in her 2 cracked hands, hands that had scrubbed blood and wine and worse from royal cloth for 4 decades, and she said the last kind thing anyone in Ironhold would say to her. You were the only one of them who ever looked me in the eye. Whatever you're going to become out there, become it fully. Don't you dare come back small. And Maelys, who had not wept when her heart was called plain, wept now, once, briefly, and then she pulled up her plain grey hood and slipped down the servants' stair and out through the laundry gate, past the sleeping guards, into the blue dark before dawn. And the great gates of Ironhold Keep closed behind her without a sound, and no bell rang, and no wolf howled, and the Alpha King slept on beside the borrowed woman in the borrowed scent, entirely unaware that the true foundation of his house had just walked out into the cold and taken the load-bearing wall with her. 6 months later, in the free port city of Marovgrad, where the mountains met the sea, and no king's writ ran unchallenged, there was a woman whom the merchants called the Ledger Queen, though not one of them knew she had ever worn a crown. She kept a narrow counting house on the Street of Scales, 3 stories of honest grey stone with a green door, and she rose before the gulls and worked until the harbour lamps were lit. And in half a year she had become the single most consequential person in the financial life of the northern coast without ever once raising her voice. Her name, she told them, was Mara Vane. She had appeared in the spring with a modest sum of untraceable capital, a mind like a steel trap, and an uncanny, almost supernatural instinct for which shipping ventures would founder and which would fly, and she had turned that modest sum through a series of loans and salvage rights and quietly acquired debts into something that was no longer modest at all. The merchants did not love her exactly, because love is not the emotion that clever, ruthless competence inspires, but they trusted her, which in Marovgrad was worth a great deal more, and they feared her a little, which was worth more still. She never cheated. That was the thing that unsettled them. She never needed to. She simply understood the true shape of value more clearly than anyone else in the room, and she waited. Always she waited, with a patience that felt less like a virtue and more like a natural force, until the shape of the world bent to match what she had known all along. She was not alone. This too surprised the merchants, who had assumed a woman that formidable must be a spinster of ice. Her partner in the counting house was a broad, weathered, quiet man named Corvin Ash, a former sea captain who had lost a ship and a fortune to a crooked insurer and had washed up on the Street of Scales with nothing but a talent for reading men's faces and a stubborn, bone-deep sense of fair dealing. He had come to Mara Vane to ask for a loan, and she had, instead of lending him money, offered him a partnership, because in the 10 minutes he sat across from her desk, she had watched him refuse 3 easy opportunities to shade the truth in his own favour, and she had learned, the hard way, in a keep made of black stone, exactly how rare and how precious that was. He respected her the way a sailor respects the sea, without sentiment and without limit. He did not care that she had come from nowhere. He did not ask about the fine, faded scar of grief she wore behind her eyes. He judged her entirely by the quality of her work and the straightness of her word. And it was, Maelis thought sometimes in the lamplit quiet after the ledgers were closed, the first time in her whole life that a man had valued her for what she could do, rather than for how conveniently she could be owned. They were not lovers. Not yet. But there was a thing growing between them, slow and real and unforced, a thing built on the solid ground of mutual usefulness and honest regard, and it was so different from the fevered, unequal, devouring thing she had felt for Kalin that she sometimes didn't recognize it as belonging to the same family of feeling at all. News of the north came to Marovgrad, the way all news comes to a port, on the tongues of sailors and in the margins of shipping manifests. And Maelis read it the way a physician reads a fever chart, dispassionately, thoroughly, with a growing private certainty. The Ashfell Dominion was in trouble. The grain truce with the river clans had collapsed within 2 months of her departure, because Kalin had sent a blustering war captain to renegotiate it, and the war captain had insulted the clan mothers, and the mothers had closed the granaries, and now the price of northern bread had tripled, and the border villages were hungry and restless. The treasury, deprived of the invisible woman who had understood its every artery, had begun to hemorrhage. Debts that Maelis had held in careful, humane suspension were being called in by their new holders who answered to a green door in Marovgrad, and the crown could not understand why obligations it had never known it carried were suddenly falling due all at once. And the iron mines of the northern reach, the true engine of everything, were tangled in a sudden and inexplicable dispute over their charter, because a Marovgrad shipping concern had quietly purchased the ancient, never-transferred ore rights from the last living descendant of the family that had held them before the conquest, and that concern was now, very politely, very legally, asking the Alpha King by whose authority he had been extracting and selling iron that did not belong to him. Maelys read each of these reports as they came, and she did not smile, and she did not gloat, and she felt none of the hot triumph she had once imagined she would feel. She felt only the cold, level satisfaction of a woman watching a structure settle onto the foundation she had spent 3 years secretly excavating out from under it. She had not knocked the house down. She had simply stopped holding it up and revealed to anyone with eyes to see that she had been the only thing holding it up all along. Corvin found her one evening at the tall window, watching a storm build out over the black water. "The Northern King," he said, because he had learned to read her silences as well as her ledgers. "The one whose debts keep landing on our desk. You know him." It was not a question. Maelys did not turn from the glass. "I did," she said. "Once." Corvin was quiet a while. Then he said, in his plain way, "Whatever he did, it was a fool's bargain. A man who trades an anchor for a figurehead deserves the reef." She almost laughed. It was the closest thing to a compliment he knew how to give, and it was worth more than every jeweled flattery Kaelin had ever pressed into her hair. "There's a delegation coming," she said, "from Ashfell, seeking a loan. A very large one, secured against the future output of the mines they no longer clearly own. They'll be here within the month, hat in hand, to beg the richest financier on the coast to save their crumbling kingdom. And the richest financier on the coast," Corvin said slowly, "is you." "Is us," she corrected. And this time she did turn, and there was something in her face that made the big man go still, something ancient and patient and absolutely without mercy, folded neatly inside a perfect, serene calm. "They don't know it's me. They think Mara Vane is a stranger who happens to hold their fate in her hands." She looked back out at the gathering storm. "Let them keep thinking it," she said, "right up until the moment it stops being useful. Cheap revenge is a torch, Corvin. It burns bright and then it's ash. I am not building a torch. I am building a winter." The delegation from Ashfell arrived in Marovgrad on a grey afternoon, and Maelys knew the exact hour of their coming, because she owned, through a lattice of intermediaries, the harbour master's dock rolls, and she had watched the name of the northern ship approach up the coast for days, the way one watches a slow tide. She did not go down to meet them. She let them wait. She let them take rooms at the second-best inn on the Street of Scales, because the best inn was quietly hers and she did not want them comfortable, and she let 3 days pass while the delegation sent increasingly anxious requests for an audience with the Ledger Queen, and each request was answered by Corvin with grave, unhurried courtesy and no fixed date. This too was a lesson she had learned in a keep of black stone, that power is very largely a matter of who is made to wait for whom. When Kaelin Thorne had wanted her, in the old days, she had come at once, always at once, grateful to be summoned. She had learned since then that the person who comes at once is the person who has already surrendered. So she let the Alpha King's men sweat in a mediocre inn while the autumn rains came down on the slate roofs of Marovgrad, and she attended to her other business, and she waited to learn who, exactly, they had sent. It was Corvin who brought her the passenger list, and it was Corvin who watched her face very carefully as she read it, because he had come to understand that the smallest changes in her expression signalled the largest shifts in the world. The delegation was led, the list said, by the Lady Vesperine of the 9th House, styled Consort-elect of the Ashfell Dominion. Maelys read the name and felt, distantly, the last cold ember of the old wound flare and then die. So the perfumed woman had a name at last, and a title, Consort-elect, not even queen. Not yet. 3 years since she had begun hanging her red silk in another woman's closet, and Cailan had still not made her his queen in truth. That told Maelys a great deal. It told her the elders had dug in harder than Cailan had expected. It told her the Dominion was not so far gone that its ancient houses would rubber stamp the elevation of a decorative woman who had helped run the treasury onto the rocks. And it told her that Vesperine, the beautiful, the honeyed, the sender of jasmine and amber, was frightened, because a consort-elect who has not been crowned in 3 years and whose kingdom is now visibly failing is a woman whose entire future rests on whether her alpha can pull the Dominion back from the brink, and Vesperine had come here, personally, across the mountains and down to the sea, to secure the loan that would decide it. She had come to beg. She did not know from whom. "She'll want to charm you," Corvin said. "Her sort always does. They think a smile is a currency." "It was," Maelys said. "Once. To the man she stole." She set the list down. "Bring them tomorrow. Midday. The upper counting room. And Corvin, when you announce them, use my working name only. Mara Vane. Nothing else. I want to watch her look at me and see nothing at all." That night, Maelys did not sleep well, and she was honest enough with herself to know why. It was not fear, and it was not the old grief, which had burned down to clean ash months ago. It was the strange, vertiginous knowledge that tomorrow she would sit across a table from the woman who had worn her mate's laughter and hung silk in her wardrobe and measured the throne room for new banners, and that this woman would not recognize her, would look straight through her, would try to charm and flatter and manage her the way one manages a useful stranger, and that she, Maelys, would have to sit inside her serene mask of Mara Vane and feel all of it and give away nothing. It was the hardest kind of test. Not the test of enduring cruelty, which she had passed long ago, but the test of holding absolute power over the person who had wronged her, and choosing, deliberately, the slow, patient winter over the bright, easy torch. She rose before dawn, as she always did, and she dressed with great care, not in finery, but in the severe, immaculate charcoal that Marovgrad had come to know as the uniform of the Ledger Queen, and she pinned her hair back plainly, and she looked at herself in the glass for a long moment. Plain, Cailan had called her, not like her. She looked at the plain woman in the glass, the plain woman who now held the fate of a kingdom in the palm of her hand, and she almost smiled. Then she went down to the upper counting room to wait for the woman who had stolen her life, and to find out whether that life had been worth as much as she had always secretly, defiantly believed. They came at midday, and Maelys heard them on the stair before she saw them. The click of expensive heels on old wood, the rustle of skirts that had been packed for a triumph and were now being worn to a supplication, the low, anxious murmur of the 2 aides who trailed behind. She sat with her back to the tall window so that the grey sea light fell over her shoulders and left her face in soft shadow, an old trick, the interrogator's trick, and she did not rise when the green door opened. Corvin's voice, deep and level. Mistress Mara Vane, the delegation of the Ashfell Dominion, the Lady Vesperine, consort-elect. And then the woman herself swept into the room, and Maelys looked at her for the first time in the flesh, at the woman whose scent she had smelled on her husband's collar for weeks and told herself was incense. And the first thing she felt, to her own faint surprise, was pity. Vesperine was beautiful, yes, in the obvious, effortful way of a woman who has always been told beauty is her only asset and has therefore never bothered to acquire another. She wore the arterial red, or its cousin, silk far too fine and far too warm for a working port in autumn, and jewels at her throat that had almost certainly been sold and were being worn one last time for effect, and her lovely face was arranged into an expression of gracious, condescending warmth, the expression of a great lady deigning to charm a useful merchant. She did not look at Melis and see a queen. She did not look at Melis and see anything at all except an obstacle to be flattered over. "Mistress Vane," she said, and her voice was exactly as honeyed as it had been through a half-open door 3 years ago. "How good of you to receive us at last. I confess we had begun to fear the famous Ledger Queen did not exist, that she was a story the merchants told to frighten each other." She laughed, a light, practiced laugh, and settled into the chair across the table without being invited, arranging her red skirts. "But here you are, and so plainly dressed. I had imagined someone more—" She let the sentence trail, a small, deliberate cruelty, the kind she clearly dispensed by reflex. "Grand?" Melis offered, in the low, even voice she had built over 6 months, a voice with no north in it, no keep, no history. "Grandeur is expensive, my lady. I prefer to spend my money on things that pay me back." Vesperine's smile flickered, just slightly, because she had come expecting to be the cleverest person in the room and had just been, very mildly, corrected. "Of course," she said, recovering. "How practical. That is precisely why we have come to you, and not to the fat bankers of the guild. We were told you understand value where others see only risk." And then she began her pitch, and Melis sat perfectly still and listened, and it was an extraordinary thing to witness, because Vesperine did not know the accounts. She had clearly been given a script by someone who did, one of the anxious aides, perhaps, or some clerk back in Ironhold, but she did not understand it, and every time Maelis asked a quiet, precise question about the projected mine yields, about the terms of the grain contracts, about the collateral, the beautiful woman's answers grew vaguer and more airy and more reliant on charm, until the gap between the two of them was as wide and cold as the sea outside the window. She was decorative. She was hollow. She had been handed the running of a crisis she could not even describe, because the man who loved her had never understood that the woman he discarded had been doing exactly this. Quietly, brilliantly, invisibly, for 3 years, and he had assumed that any beautiful woman could simply step into the shape of it. Melis watched Vesperine flounder, and felt the last of the old wound close over entirely, cleanly, leaving not even a scar, because you cannot grieve being replaced by someone once you have seen, with your own eyes, that you were not replaced at all. You were merely removed, and nothing had been put in your place, and the house had begun to fall. "So, you see," Vesperine concluded, having said almost nothing of substance in a great many pretty words, "with the backing of a house as respected as yours, the Dominion will weather this small turbulence, and the Alpha King will be most generous in his gratitude. Most generous. A financier who does the crown this service could expect royal favor. Trading charters, a seat at the Northern Councils." She leaned forward, and the jasmine and amber reached across the table, and Melis did not flinch from the scent that had once broken her heart, because it no longer had any power over her at all. "The king rewards loyalty," Vesperina said, and it took everything Melis had, everything, not to laugh aloud at that particular sentence, from that particular mouth. Instead, she folded her hands on the ledger before her and let a silence build, a long, deliberate, expensive silence, and she watched the confidence drain slowly out of the beautiful woman's face, the way the wine had once drained up the rim of a trembling goblet. "Tell me, my lady," Meilis said at last, very softly. "Does the king know exactly how deep the debts run? Or have his advisers protected him from the true numbers, as advisers do?" Vesperine hesitated, and in that hesitation, Melis saw the whole rotten architecture of Ironhold laid bare, and she saw, too, the outline of something larger and colder standing behind the beautiful, frightened woman, and she understood that the story was not yet finished, that there was a hand behind this hand, and she leaned back into the grey light and prepared at last to turn the chair. "The king," Vesperine said carefully, and for the first time the honey in her voice had thinned to show the fear beneath it, "trusts his counsel, as is proper. The debts are being managed. They are being called," Meilis corrected gently. "By me. Though you did not know that until this moment, and I can see from your face that you are only now beginning to understand what it means." She rose then, unhurried, and moved to the sideboard where a decanter stood, and she poured a single glass of pale wine, and she did not offer one to her guest, and the omission was so pointed that one of the aides shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Let me tell you what I know, my lady, and you will tell me whether the king knows it too. The iron mines that are meant to secure this loan you have come to beg for are the subject of a charter dispute that the crown will lose, because the ore rights were never legally transferred after the conquest and are now held by a Marovgrad concern. The grain truce that fed your border villages collapsed the moment a certain woman stopped negotiating it, and cannot be repaired by the war captain who broke it. The treasury is not merely low, it is structurally insolvent, because the person who understood how its debts were suspended is gone, and every one of those suspended debts has come due at once into the hands of holders who all, curiously, answer to the same green door on this street." She turned, and the sea light was behind her, and her face was still in shadow, but her voice had changed now, had let a little of the north creep back in, and Vesperine's eyes had gone very wide. "You did not come to me for a loan, my lady. You came to me for a rescue, and you did not know, until I told you just now, that the woman you came to beg is the woman who owns the very debts that are drowning you." The silence in the upper counting room was total. Somewhere below, a cart rattled over the cobbles of the Street of Scales. A gull cried out over the harbour. Vesperina's beautiful mouth had come slightly open, and her hand had risen without her knowing it to the souled jewels at her throat, and she was staring at the plain woman by the window with the dawning, sick confusion of someone who feels the floor of a familiar room tilt beneath her feet. "Who?" she began, and had to stop and start again. "Who are you?" Meilis set down her wine. She reached up slowly and unpinned her plain, severe hair and let it fall the way it had fallen on a night 3 years ago when a man had laughed and called her a shadow, and she stepped forward out of the shadow of the window and into the full grey light so that the consort-elect of the Ashfell Dominion could see her face at last, entire and unhidden. "You hung your dresses in my closet," Melis said, in a voice as level and cold and clear as glacier melt, before I had even left the room. Red silk, midnight blue, a morning robe of cream and gold that smelled of jasmine and amber. I remember them very well, my lady, I left them exactly where you hung them, because they were never mine to touch. As the crown, in the end, was never mine to keep. She watched the recognition break over Vesperine's face, like a wave breaking on rock, watched the beautiful features contort through disbelief and horror and a flash of the old contempt, and then finally into raw, naked fear, and Melis felt nothing but the clean, cold satisfaction of a debt entered accurately into a ledger. "You," Vesperine whispered. "You're dead. The border carriage," they said. "The king said you'd gone to the villages, that I'd conveniently died, as inconvenient wives do," Melis said. "No, I did what your predecessors were too broken to do. I took nothing he gave me, and I built something he could never take. My name is Melis. Once I was queen of the Ashfell Dominion. Now I am the woman who holds its throat in her 2 hands, and you have come a very long way and worn your last jewels to place yourself entirely at my mercy." Vesperine stood, so fast her chair scraped and nearly toppled, and the aides by the door tensed, and for a moment the old fury flashed through the fear, the reflexive fury of a woman accustomed to command. "You forget yourself," she hissed. "You are a merchant, a jumped-up clerk playing at power. When the king learns you are alive, when he learns what you have done to his kingdom out of jealous spite—" "He will do what?" Maelis asked, and she did not raise her voice, and that was what made it terrible. "March an army across the mountains in winter to a free city where his writ doesn't run, to attack the one financier who could have saved him, over debts that are entirely legal and entirely mine. He will beg, my lady. As you are begging now, though you're too proud to have noticed yet, that is what this is." She let that land. "You called it jealous spite. It is not spite. Spite is loud and hot and stupid. This is a ledger, balanced to the coin. I didn't take one thing that was his. I didn't steal. I didn't lie. I simply stopped holding up a house that had decided I was a shadow, and I let the world discover, all on its own, in its own time, exactly how much weight that shadow had been carrying." She came closer now, close enough to smell the jasmine and amber that no longer meant anything, close enough that Vesperine, taller and younger, and dressed in red, took an involuntary step back. "Sit down," Melis said quietly. "You wanted a queen who understood value. Sit down and I will teach you what things are truly worth." Vesperine sat. She sat because there was nothing else to do, because the walls of her world had just fallen away and revealed that she was standing on the edge of a drop, and Melis returned, unhurried, to her own chair behind the ledgers, the great books that were the true seats of power in the new world she had built for herself. "Here is what will happen," she said. "I know already that you did not engineer this alone. A woman who cannot answer a single question about the collateral she has traveled a month to pledge did not conceive of this scheme. Someone sent you. Someone who understood that the Dominion was failing and saw in its failure an opportunity. Someone who whispered in the king's ear that a beautiful consort would be an ornament to a strong reign, knowing all the while that the reign was not strong, that it was hollowing, that removing the one competent hand from the treasury would hasten a collapse that would leave the whole Dominion ripe for the taking. You are not the architect of Ashfell's ruin, my lady. You are its instrument. As, I begin to suspect, was I." She watched Vesperine's face, and she saw the flinch, the tiny betraying flicker at the words someone sent you, and she knew she had struck bone. "Tell me his name," Melis said softly, "and I will decide whether you drown with the ship or are permitted to swim to a colder, poorer, safer shore. Refuse, and I will call in the last of the debts within the week, and the dominion will fall before the first snow, and you will fall with it, and no one, my lady, no one at all, will remember your name." For a long moment Vesperine said nothing, and Melis let the silence do its work, the way she let everything do its work, patiently, without heat. Then the beautiful woman's composure cracked all at once, the way ice cracks, and what came out from behind it was not the honeyed schemer, but a frightened, overreached young woman who had gambled her whole life on a man's affection and was watching it come to nothing. "His name is Lord Sabreth," she said, very low. "Sabreth of the River Clans. He came to the king 2 years ago, after the old truce, offering friendship, offering marriages, offering me. He told the king that binding a River Clan beauty to the crown would seal the peace and please the elders. And he told me, privately, that Caelan Thorne was a weak king propped up by a clever wife, and that if the wife were removed, the king would lean on his new consort, and through the consort on the friends who had given her. I did not understand then that removing you would break everything." Her voice broke. "I thought you were nothing. He told me you were nothing. Everyone said. The king said I was a shadow," Melis finished, without cruelty. "Yes, I heard him say it. It is how this whole story began." She sat back. So there it was, the greater hand, the true architect, a River Clan lord playing a longer game than the king, than the consort, than anyone in Ironhold had guessed, weaponizing a foolish alpha's contempt for his own wife to hollow a kingdom from within. And Melis, who had been discarded as the pawn of that scheme, had walked away and made herself, unknowingly, the one force capable of unraveling it. The irony was so vast and so clean that she almost admired it. "Lord Sabreth," she said. "He engineered the truce collapse as well, I imagine. Made certain the war captain who insulted the clan mothers was chosen. He wanted the border hungry and angry. Hunger is the cheapest weapon there is." Vesperine nodded, wretched. "He controls the grain now. The clans that close their granaries answer to him. He means to march on Ironhold in the spring as a savior to feed the starving villages and take the crown from a king too weak to hold it. And I was to be waiting inside the walls to open the gate." She looked up, and her eyes were wet, and for the first time she looked less like a rival and more like what she was, a used and frightened girl. I did not want it to go so far. I only wanted to be a queen. Melis regarded her for a long moment, and in that moment she felt the whole shape of the endgame assemble itself in her mind, complete and elegant, the way the answer to a long column of figures assembles itself when the last number is finally placed. She had come into this room intending only a private, patient reckoning with the woman and the man who had wronged her. She was leaving it with a war to win, and a kingdom to decide the fate of, and a choice that was suddenly larger than her own hurt. She could let it all burn. She could call the debts, and let Sabreth take Ironhold, and stand on this coast and watch the black stone keep where she had been called a shadow pass into the hands of a colder and cleverer predator, and it would cost her nothing, and she would be, in the narrow sense, avenged. Or she could do the harder thing, the thing that separated a torch from a winter, and use everything she had built not merely to punish the people who had discarded her, but to save the very kingdom that had failed her, on her own terms, in her own name, so that not one soul left alive in the Ashfell dominion could ever again pretend she had been nothing. She looked at Vesperine, and she made her decision. and it was not made from mercy, though it would look like mercy, and it was not made from love, for that was long dead, but it was made from the cold, clean certainty of a woman who has finally understood exactly what she is worth and intends to make the whole world understand it too. "You will not open the gate for Sabreth," she said. "You will open it for me." The plan that Mylus laid out across her ledgers that afternoon was so audacious in its patience, and so total in its reach, that even Corvin, who had watched her turn a modest stake into an empire in half a year, went quiet listening to it. She did not intend to march an army. She had no army, and armies were expensive and clumsy, and, in her considered opinion, the tool of people who had run out of better ideas. She intended, instead, to do what she had always done, which was to control the true flow of value beneath the loud and visible surface of power, and to let the men with swords discover, too late, that the ground had shifted under their feet. She would grant the Dominion its loan, she told Vesperine, but not to the king, and not through the council, and not on the terms the delegation had come to beg. She would grant it directly to the RiverClan granaries, buying the entire grain surplus of the north at a fair and generous price, in honest coin, through Ren, her mother's cousin, the healer who held the old plague debt and commanded more quiet loyalty among the clan mothers than 100 Lord Sabreths with 100 schemes. In one stroke she would take Sabreth's cheapest weapon out of his hand, because a lord cannot starve a boarder into welcoming him as a saviour if the boarder's bread is already bought and paid for by someone else. The hungry villages would be fed before the first snow, and they would learn the name of the woman who fed them, and it would not be Sabreth, and it would not be the king, and it would not be the beautiful consort. It would be Mylus. "He will know it was you," Vesperine said. "Sabreth, the moment the grain moves, he will know someone has outbid him, and he will trace it, and he will come." "I am counting on it," Mylus said. "Let him come. Let him come to Marovgrad, to a free city, where his warriors are foreign and unwelcome, and his gold is worth exactly what mine says it is worth. And let him sit across this table where you are sitting now, and discover that the woman he removed from the board 3 years ago has become the board. Sabreth understands power as a thing you seize. I understand it as a thing you own. When he arrives, he will find that I hold his debts, his rivals' debts, the mines, the grain, and the loyalty of the very clan mothers he thought were his. He will have nothing to seize, because everything he wanted will already be mine, honestly and legally, in ink." She turned to Corvin. "Send word to Ren tonight, and send a second letter, by a slower and more visible road, to the Council of Elders at Ironhold. Not to the king, to the elders. Inform them, in plain and formal language, that the House of Vane, sole creditor to the crown, requires an accounting, and that the House of Vane will forgive the entirety of the Dominion's debt, will restore the grain truce, and will guarantee the northern reach against the ambitions of Lord Sabreth of the River Clans, on one single condition." She let the pause stretch, "that the Alpha King present himself here, in person, to sign the terms. Not an envoy, not a consort, the king, in the counting house on the Street of Scales, hat in hand." It was Corvin who understood first what she was truly asking for, and something like awe moved across his weathered face. "You want him to come to you," he said slowly. "The man who called you a shadow. You want him to cross the mountains in winter and walk through that green door and beg the House of Vane to save his kingdom, without knowing whose house it is. I want him," Mylus said, "to make the journey I made, in the cold, with nothing certain, toward a door he doesn't understand, and I want him to walk into this room and see a plain woman he doesn't at first recognize, and try to command her the way he commanded everyone his whole life, and I want him to fail, and to keep failing, and to slowly understand, one word at a time, exactly who is sitting across the table, and exactly what he threw away, and exactly how completely his life is now in the hands of the shadow he lit a lamp to erase. She was quiet a moment. And then I want to save his kingdom anyway. Not for him. For the villages, and the border pups, and the clan mothers, and old Ottolin in the drying yard, and every soul in the Dominion who is worth 10 of him. I will save it all. On my terms, in my name. And I will let him live the rest of his reign, knowing that the woman he discarded is the reason he has a throne to sit on, and that he sits on it entirely by her leave. Vesperine was staring at her now with an expression Maelys had not seen before, an expression that was almost reverence, the look of a decorative woman who has spent her whole life around power and has just, for the first time, seen the real thing. "And me?" she asked, very small. "What happens to me?" Maelys looked at her for a long, level moment. "That," she said, "depends entirely on whether you can learn, between now and the day he arrives, to become something more than an ornament. I do not need your beauty, my lady, but a woman who has been close to Sabrith, who knows his mind and his plans and his men, who can testify before the elders as to how this ruin was engineered. That woman I can use. Stay. Work. Make yourself worth keeping. It's the same test I passed 3 years ago in a colder house than this one. I survived it. Let us see if you can." The letters went out, and then began the long, patient waiting that was Maelys's truest art, and the winter came down over Marovgrad and the northern reach, and the world moved along the channels she had cut for it. Wren's granaries opened, and the honest coin flowed north, and the hungry border villages were fed, and up and down the frozen roads of the Dominion the people spoke a new name over their restored bread, the name of the mysterious southern house that had saved them when their own king could not, and they did not yet know that the house had a woman at its head, and that the woman had once been their queen. Lord Sabreth's careful scheme began to come apart in his hands, like wet paper. He found his purchased granaries suddenly empty, his clan mothers suddenly cold to him, his cheap weapon of hunger struck clean out of his grasp by an unseen hand that paid better and asked less. He raged and he threatened, and he sent men south to Marovgrad to learn who had done this, and the men returned with word of a financier called the Ledger Queen, a woman of no known origin who had appeared in the spring and now held the entire economic life of the coast in her fist, and Sabreth, who was cleverer by far than Cailan, understood at once that he was no longer playing against a weak king, but against something he did not comprehend, and for the first time in his long, patient scheming, he was afraid. And at Ironhold, in the great council hall of black basalt, where Maelys had once brought her husband wine, the letter from the House of Vane was read aloud to the assembled elders, and there was uproar, and there was disbelief, and there was, beneath it all, a slow and dreadful dawning as the elders totaled the debts and understood how completely the crown was owned, and every eye in that hall turned, at last, to the Alpha King upon his throne, and waited to see what he would do. Cailan Thorne came to Marovgrad in the deep of winter, and he came, in the end, exactly as Maelys had demanded, in person, with a small guard, having crossed the frozen mountains and descended to the grey winter sea, because the alternative laid before him by his own elders was the loss of everything, and even a proud man will make a cold journey to save his throne. Melis knew the hour of his arrival, as she had known the delegations, because she owned the harbour rolls, and she watched the northern ship beat up the coast through the winter mist for 2 days, and she felt, as it approached, not the storm she had braced for, but a strange and enormous calm, the calm of a ledger about to be closed. She let him wait, of course. Not 3 days this time, but one, a single, deliberate day, long enough for the Alpha King of the Ashfell Dominion to sit in a mediocre inn on the Street of Scales and taste, perhaps for the first time in his gilded life, what it was to be made to wait upon the pleasure of another. And when at last she sent Corvin to summon him, she prepared for the meeting exactly as she had prepared for Vesperine, in severe charcoal, her hair pinned plain, her back to the tall window and the grey sea light, the great ledgers open on the table before her like the scales of a cold and patient justice. He came up the stair, and she heard his tread, and she knew it in her body before her mind could catch up, the particular weight and rhythm of the man she had loved and hated and buried, and to her quiet pride she felt her heartbeat stay level and slow. The green door opened. Corvin's voice, deep and neutral. Mistress Mara Vane, the delegation of the Ashfell Dominion, Caelan Thorne, not the Alpha King, not his majesty, just the name. Corvin had understood the assignment. And then Caelan came into the room, and Melis looked, at last, upon the face of the man who had called her a shadow. He had aged. 6 months of a collapsing kingdom had carved lines into his face that 3 years of marriage never had, and there was grey now at his temples that had not been there when she left, and his shoulders, once carried with the easy arrogance of a man who had never in his life been refused, had a new and unfamiliar stoop to them, the stoop of a king who has learned, too late, the weight of his own crown. He did not recognize her. That was the first and sweetest thing. He looked across the room at the plain woman in charcoal with the sea light behind her, and he saw a financier, an obstacle, a foreign power to be managed, and he arranged his tired face into the practiced warmth of a man who has come to charm what he cannot command, the very same expression his consort had worn, and Melis understood that they had always been alike. Those two, both of them believing that a smile was a currency, and that the world could be flattered into forgiving them anything. "Mistress Vane," he said, and his voice was still deep, still rich, still carried the warm, low note that had once undone her in the dark, and it moved through her now and touched nothing at all, the way wind moves through a bare tree in winter. "I have come a very long way to thank you. The grain you sent to my border villages saved lives this winter. Whatever the terms of your loan, know that the Ashfell Dominion doesn't forget its friends." He was reaching for the old machinery, the machinery of a king dispensing favor, trying to reframe a supplication as a gift he was graciously receiving, and Melis let him finish, and let the silence gather. And then she spoke, in the low, even voice, with no north in it. "Sit down," she said. He blinked. Kings are not told to sit. But he was tired, and he was far from home, and the woman held his kingdom in her ledgers. So after a moment's hesitation, he sat in the same chair Vesperine had sat in, and Melis watched him lower himself into it, and felt the last thread of the old grief dissolve entirely, leaving nothing behind but the clear, cold water of a debt about to be paid. "I did not send the grain as a friend," she said. "I sent it as a creditor, protecting an asset. Your villages are worth more to me alive and fed than dead and empty, and so I fed them. Do not mistake arithmetic for affection, my lord. It is a mistake you have made before, and it has cost you a great deal." Something flickered in his face, a first faint unease, the sense of a man who has walked into a room and found the furniture subtly rearranged. "You speak very boldly to a king," he said. "I speak plainly to a debtor," she answered. "The two are easily confused by men who have never before owed anything to anyone." She rose then, and she came around the table into the grey light, and she watched him look up at her, and she watched him begin, at last, to see. It came slowly, the way dawn comes, the recognition rising through the exhaustion and the arrogance and the 6 hard months, some old animal part of him catching first the shape of her, then the set of her shoulders, then the eyes, and she saw the colour leave his face by degrees, the blood draining exactly as her wine had once climbed a trembling rim, until he was staring at her white and stricken like a man watching the dead sit up. "Melis," he whispered. She let her hair down. She did it slowly, deliberately, the same plain hair that a man had once laughed at in the dark, and she stepped fully into the light so there could be no mercy of doubt. "You called me a shadow," she said, in a voice as level as still water. "You said no one remembers a shadow once the lamp is lit. Do you remember saying it, Cailan? I do. I remember every word. I was standing in the corridor with your wine in my hands." His mouth worked. No sound came. The Alpha King of the Ashfell Dominion, who had ruled a black stone kingdom and commanded the wolves of the north, sat in a merchant's chair in a free city and could not find a single word. "They told me you were gone," he managed at last, hoarse, "dead in the villages. I searched." "You didn't search," she said, without heat. "You lit your lamp and you forgot the shadow, exactly as you promised. And the shadow walked out of your gilded cage before sunrise and took nothing that was yours, and built this." She gestured at the ledgers, the room, the winter city that answered to her. "Everything you are begging to be saved from, I own. Everything you need to keep your throne, I hold. You crossed the mountains to kneel to a stranger, and the stranger is the wife you threw away."